Thank you. That concludes general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1 from Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the First Minister tell the Chamber how many criminals on home detention committed offences while out on release in the last 3 years?
First Minister.
I don't have the figure to hand that would answer that specific question. I can tell the Chamber, though, that since it was introduced in 2006, there have been 21,000 people released on a home detention curfew. 0.3% of that total are people who are currently unlawfully at large. Of course, at any one time, there are around 300 people on home detention curfew, which is about 4% of the prison population, and 99.7% of those will be prisoners who've been sentenced to less than 4 years. I assume the reason for Ruth Davidson's question, the entirely understandable reason for Ruth Davidson's question, is the case of James Wright that has been reported this week. Can I firstly say that this is an appalling case and he committed a dreadful crime, and I want to take the opportunity to express my deepest sympathies to Mr McClelland's family and to his friends. The Chamber will be aware that the Justice Secretary has asked both the Chief Inspector of Prisons and the Chief Inspector of Constabulary to conduct a review of home detention curfew, which will look at the process for assessing whether someone should be placed on home detention curfew, and it will also review the process for investigating breaches of home detention curfew terms and apprehending those individuals. Final point I would make, Presiding Officer, is that I think all members across the Chamber would accept that systems like this are an important part of preparing individuals for release. They're about reintegrating prisoners into society, which helps to reduce the risk of reoffending. But home detention curfew is not an entitlement for prisoners. Prisoners should only be eligible if they're assessed to be at low risk of reoffending. So if there are lessons to be learned from this case, and undoubtedly there will be, I'm determined that they will be learned.
Ruth Davidson.
In this case, it was someone with 16 previous convictions. He'd been caught carrying a knife twice and he went on to stab someone to death. But the First Minister couldn't answer the question that I asked, and the reason that she couldn't is because no one can, because the data isn't collated and the figures are not released. In fact, the only time we do find out is in a week like this, when one of these criminals, like James Wright, turns up in court having murdered father of 3, Craig McClelland. I think that's unacceptable. If criminals are being released from jail, tagged and then going on to commit violent crimes, don't the public have a right to know how many?
First Minister.
Well, I should say that I will not stand here today, and I don't think anybody would expect me to, and defend any aspect of what happened in the particular case we are talking about. That's why it is right that there is a full review, both by the Chief Inspector of Prisons and by the Chief Inspector of Constabulary. And if the issue that Ruth Davidson is raised is one of the recommendations that comes forward from those reviews, then of course the Government will respond to that. We've discussed these issues in the Chamber before, and I think we all recognise that these are some of the most difficult and sensitive issues that we discuss as politicians in this parliamentary chamber. I think most MSPs across the Chamber accept that it is important to have systems in place that help to rehabilitate prisoners. It's not in society's best interest if prisoners are released before steps have been taken to ensure that they can be properly reintegrated into society. That will increase the risk of reoffending, not reduce the risk of reoffending. So systems like this are important, but it is also extremely important that the right safeguards are in place. The vast majority of people who are released on home detention curfew, 76% to be precise, successfully complete their home detention curfew. We know that around 20% of prisoners are recalled due to a breach of their conditions. If there are lessons to be learned and if there are changes to the process that are required to be made, then I'm determined those changes will be made. But it is important that we continue to focus on what we need to do to ensure the rehabilitation of prisoners, because that is in the interest of the safety of society as well.
Ruth Davidson.
First Minister is right to say that the Justice Secretary has instructed an investigation into why James Wright was free to kill 6 months after he had breached his home detention curfew. But in doing so, he has admitted that the system is flawed. Yet under its new Management of Offenders Bill, the Government is proposing to move to a system which puts far more reliance on tagged criminals in the community, not less. So we don't know how many criminals on home release are committing crimes. The Government accepts that there is a problem, but we're going to have more electronic tagging anyway. Wouldn't it make sense to put these plans on hold, at least until we can reassure the public that the system actually works? Isn't it time to put victims first for once?
First Minister.
I think systems like this are about trying to put victims first, in making sure that we have processes in place that are about effective rehabilitation of prisoners. I am not, and never would try to defend what's happened in this case. But cases like this, appalling though they are, and this case is absolutely appalling, do not necessarily mean that the whole system is not working. Something went badly wrong in this case. It's important that we look carefully at that, and if there are wider lessons to be learned, that we learn those wider lessons. In terms of extension of tagging, this is about extension of tagging for people who would be on community orders, and I think it's important that we debate that as a parliament. Of course, and I don't want to politicise this issue because I don't think it is appropriate to do so, but if we listen to some of what Ruth Davidson's colleagues south of the border are saying about Scotland's approach to community sentences, they're actually saying that they think there's a lot to be learnt from what Scotland is doing. So we must look carefully at appalling cases like this one, but we must do that properly and we must apply any lessons sensibly. That's exactly what we will do, and in terms of any future reforms and any future changes, that's for this Parliament to debate and decide in the normal way.
Ruth Davidson.
I've listened to 3 answers, and the First Minister has repeated the word rehabilitation like a mantra, like that's the reason for extending tagging. But I've got the policy memorandum for the Management of Offenders Bill here, and the reason for it, as stated by the Government, is that the introduction is to make the use of electronic monitoring more appealing to sheriffs as an alternative to custody. So it's an instead of, not just for rehabilitation. But this case has rightly drawn the focus on home release. But the issues here go far, far deeper. It's not just on home release, but it's also on parole and it's on sentencing too. We say that it is simply wrong that someone with 16 previous convictions, including 2 for knife crimes, should be let out with a tag. It's wrong that victims and their family don't have the right to speak at parole board hearings. And it's wrong that victims can't challenge the decision to let criminals out on parole. Scotland's justice system is tilted far too much in favour of those convicted of crime and too often turns a deaf ear to the victims of those crimes. It is long past time that we had action from this government to correct that basic injustice. So we ask, widen the parole review, allow the victims to speak. When are we finally going to see those actions being taken?
First Minister.
Well, can I deal with the parole part of the question first? Because as Ruth Davidson knows, the Parole Board for Scotland is an independent judicial body. Its processes are continually kept under review, and we actually are already in discussions with the Parole Board for Scotland on possible future development of its rules in light of the review of the War Boys case south of the border. Can I turn to the more general issue? Can I preface my remarks by saying I am not referring to the individual case that has been raised this week. That is an appalling case and it is subject to the reviews that the Justice Secretary has outlined. But more generally, it is not the case that our justice system is tilted towards criminals rather than victims. Scotland has one of the highest prison populations anywhere in Western Europe right now. Part of the problem is that we know prison is not the most effective sentence in terms of reducing reoffending for some of those who commit offences. Listen to what the UK Justice Secretary said only recently. He said this, and this is the Tory UK Justice Secretary: the evidence shows that when somebody's been inside for less than 12 months, the reoffending rate is about 66%, but the reoffending rate for those who get a non-custodial sentence is lower. Therefore, short sentences should be a last resort. Well, Ruth Davidson saying this murder, I actually said I wasn't referring to the individual case. I'm making a wider point, which is what Ruth Davidson went on to do. What we need to ensure with sentencing is that it is as effective as it possibly can be and has the best possible chance, not just of punishing, punishment is important, but also of reducing reoffending. Because by reducing reoffending, we help to keep the public safer as well. That's the motivation behind the reforms that we are taking forward. Ruth Davidson's colleagues south of the border think that they are sensible reforms. I respect the views that Ruth Davidson is putting forward, but let's debate these issues properly and maturely as a parliament, because I think that's what the public would deserve and expect of us.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On Wednesday, the 25th of February 2015, the Cabinet Secretary for Health told the BBC's Good Morning Scotland programme that, and I quote, "I want over the course of this year to eradicate delayed discharge out of the system. I am absolutely determined to do that." First Minister, how did that go?
First Minister.
Well, actually, we've seen a reduction in the number of bed days lost to delayed discharge. In 2017-18, we saw a reduction of 7% on the previous year. That built on a 3% reduction the year before that and a 9% reduction the previous year. So that's what's happened since the date of the quote that Richard Leonard has just read out. In fact, under Shona Robertson as Health Secretary, there has been a 24% reduction in the number of bed days lost to delayed discharge. And I can tell Richard Leonard that that is the equivalent to 435 extra beds in our NHS. So progress has been made and we are determined to continue that progress in the months and years ahead.
Richard Leonard.
So, to be absolutely clear, more than 3 years ago, Shona Robertson made a promise to the people of Scotland to eradicate delayed discharge out of the system. And we are still waiting. And I know that the First Minister understands that this is a matter of serious concern. I know because back in 2011, Nicola Sturgeon explained to the SNP conference that delayed discharges waste NHS resources and rob older people of their quality of life. They were, she said, equivalent to a large acute hospital being occupied all year by people who don't need to be there, and it costs £50 million. So can the First Minister tell us today exactly how much 3 years of Shona Robertson's broken promises on delayed discharge has cost our National Health Service?
First Minister.
Well, we know that because people are living longer, which is a good thing, there are greater demands on our health service. That's why we are investing more money in our health service. It's why we've got higher funding per head of population than other parts of the UK. There are nearly 13,000 more staff in post in our NHS. And of course, we're investing more money in social care as well. But let me go back to the specific issue of delayed discharge. Tackling delayed discharge is challenging. I'll be the first to accept that. But we see delayed discharge very clearly on a downward trend. There's been a reduction of nearly 40,000 bed days lost to delay between 2016-17 and 2017-18. And as I said earlier on, that builds on reductions in the 2 previous years. In April, 10 of the partnerships across the country had standard delays over 3 days down to single figures. And it's just 4 partnerships that account actually for almost half of the total delays, so we are focusing on trying to reduce them. And as I said earlier on, there's been under Shona Robertson, since Shona Robertson became Health Secretary, the number of bed days lost to delayed discharge is down 24%. That's over 40,000 bed days, equivalent to more than 400 extra beds. So this is going in the right direction. It's tough, it's challenging. That's not just the case in Scotland. Governments across the UK, across Europe and across the world struggle with this issue. But in Scotland, we're making progress. We're making progress because of the investments we've made, because partly of the integration of health and social care, and because we're increasing the numbers working in our NHS, and we will continue to focus on doing exactly that.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, the question I asked was how much had Shona Robertson's broken promises on delayed discharge cost the health service in Scotland since 2015? And the answer is £392 million. £392 million, Presiding Officer. And this week, the government was forced to admit that it has not met its A&E waiting times target for 8 consecutive months, that hundreds of operations are being cancelled every single month. Waiting times are up year on year, and our hard-working NHS staff are overstretched and undervalued. First Minister, they deserve better than this. Patients deserve better than this. The people of Scotland deserve better than this. And they deserve a Health Secretary who is up to the job, So when will the First Minister finally put patience before party and accept at long last that the time has come for her Health Secretary to go?
First Minister.
Richard Leonard has just exposed there that he doesn't really care about patients. This is all about politics, as far as he's concerned. But let me talk about accident and emergency, since Richard Leonard raised that. I think it is very positive and a real credit to those working in our NHS that for 3 years in a row now, Scotland has the best accident and emergency performances in the whole of the United Kingdom, including Labour-run Wales, of course. In terms of cancelled operations, the figures that were out earlier this week show a reduction from the last figures in the numbers of operations cancelled for capacity or non-clinical reasons, down to just over 2%. And as I've said twice now, there's been a 24% reduction in the number of bed days lost to delayed discharge since Shona Robison became Health Secretary. I am always very frank about the challenges we face in the health service as demand rises. That's why we will continue to carry out the reforms that are necessary. It's why we will continue to put the investment in that is necessary and support the extra people who are working in our NHS under this government. So that's what we will get on and do, and we'll leave Richard Leonard to worry about the politics.
Thank you. There's a lot of interest from members in asking supplementaries today. We'll see how many we get through. Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, Crummock Scotland Limited, a civil engineering company in my constituency, went into receivership on Friday 1st June with a loss of 287 jobs. PACE was there on Friday, and I've been in contact with both PACE and the official receiver to find that with the publicity, prospective employers have been in touch with the receiver looking for employees. That would seem good news. However, while the receiver has the contact details for all employees, PACE does not, and under data protection, these cannot be shared. The receiver is only obliged to contact employees for redundancy pay information, which has been done. So we have potential employers on the one hand, contact details on the other, and PACE with none of the above. Can the First Minister advise what the Scottish Government can do to remedy what seems to be a preposterous situation, preventing some of those redundant walking straight back into re-employment? For example, an online facility to enable those employees to access those potential employers.
First Minister.
Well, I will return to Christine Graham on the specific point she's raised there, but on the general issue, of course, I was very concerned to learn that the construction group Crummock has ceased training, making 286 employees redundant. I know this is a difficult time for those employees, their families and the local area. Our immediate priority is to provide all the support we can to the individuals affected. PACE was on site last Friday to offer its support to affected employers who were present. PACE is also working with the Civil Engineering Contractors Association to develop a facility on their website that will allow any Crummock employee to upload a CV to be accessed by any of their members who are looking to recruit staff. I know, as she's just said so, that Christine Graham has been in contact with SDS and with Johnson Carmichael, and I hope this answer gives her some reassurance about what the Scottish Government can do, but I will look into the specific issues she has raised and get back to her. She may also be interested to know that Scottish Enterprise has made initial contact with the receivers to also understand what support they can offer at this time.
Jenny Mara.
A board paper for V&A Dundee states that our new museum needs more cash to cover operating costs, a £500,000 bank loan and potentially further government grants. It is my understanding that costs have been underestimated or missed, and there is not a clear plan for where future revenue will come from to run the museum and to service the bank loan after the initial opening phase. The V&A has been consulting with KPMG. Presiding Officer, the V&A is a flagship project for Dundee and everybody in the city really wants it to work. Can the First Minister assure me today that her government is doing everything to ensure that the V&A Dundee can be on a firm financial footing? And can she assure me, given the millions of pounds her government has invested on behalf of Dundonians, that she is keeping track of the business plan, audit and expenditure on this important project for our city?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I think it's important to point out that this project is not a Scottish Government-led project. The Scottish Government is not on the board of the project. That said, we are big supporters of the V&A Museum. We think it's a fantastic addition to Scotland's museums and the flagship of Dundee's waterfront development. The Scottish Government has provided £38 million towards the construction of the V&A in Dundee through a mix of traditional capital grant and growth accelerator funding. We have also to date contributed £5.5 million in revenue funding to support development costs in the run-up to the opening in September. I can also tell the Chamber today, and I don't believe, although I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, that this is in the public domain yet, but we have also agreed a further package of revenue support that will be worth £1 million a year and support the museum in the first 10 years of its operation. So the Scottish Government is committed to supporting this fantastic new development for Dundee. Of course, we will keep very close to Design Dundee Limited and also the Council and ensure that we are doing everything we possibly can to support it. But I think for many years, decades, generations to come, this will be a new museum that people, not just in Dundee, but right across Scotland, will be thoroughly and very rightly proud of.
John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will agree with me that it is good news for Scotland that it is proposed to build a third runway at Heathrow Airport. Will the First Minister now also support Prestwick Airport in their bid to become the Scottish logistics hub supporting the building of this new runway at Heathrow?
First Minister.
Well, of course, the Heathrow development is not a decision for the Scottish Government or indeed for the Scottish Parliament. In all of the discussions we've had with Heathrow, we've been focused on making sure if this development is to go ahead that there is maximum economic benefit for Scotland. That, of course, includes supporting Prestwick to benefit as much as possible through the logistics hub, and we will continue to ensure that we carry forward those discussions in the most constructive way.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. In light of the news that House of Fraser is seeking to close 31 of its 59 shops, including its Edinburgh store, with the loss of 2,000 House of Fraser jobs and 4,000 more jobs in brand and concession roles, what action is the Scottish Government taking to support workers in Scotland employed by the company?
First Minister.
Well, I was concerned, as I'm sure everybody was this morning, to hear of recent developments in relation to House of Fraser's plans to close stores. As we understand it, the store at the west end of Princes Street is to close, and that's likely to affect 127 jobs. It is welcome, though, that as far as we know, the current restructuring plans do not involve the other Fraser stores in Scotland, including Jenner's in Edinburgh and the flagship Glasgow store. This obviously will be a difficult time for staff working in the West End store, and therefore the PACE national team is monitoring developments and will be approaching the company to offer whatever support it can, and the Scottish Government will do whatever we can to offer support at this time.
And Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much. The First Minister will be aware of publication of internal safety reports from the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, which suggest that incidents on the project have been chronically underreported. What does she make of Transport Scotland's figure of 23 accidents in a single year, when we now know that in that year there were 27 cases of overturned vehicles, 39 cases of machinery striking pipes and cables underground, and work carried out within yards of major oil pipelines without notifying the operators? If she shares my concern about these discrepancies, will she now order an inquiry into the management of safety on the AWPR and ensure there are no shortcuts taken in achieving completion of this vital project?
First Minister.
Well, we expect any contractor on any project that we're responsible for to work to the highest standards of health and safety, and that applies to the AWPR. There is a dispute by Transport Scotland in terms of the way some of these figures have been presented. I'd be very happy to ask Transport Scotland to contact Lewis MacDonald to discuss some of those concerns in more detail. That said, we take all allegations very seriously and have raised this matter with the contractor. I think it's important also to stress that responsibility for health and safety on site rests with the contractor. However, the Health and Safety Executive, as I understand it, visited the site in April 2017, was content with the processes in place, but we will continue to discuss any concerns directly with the contractor. And as I said a moment ago, I'm happy to ask Transport Scotland to contact the member directly.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We all know that teaching can be and needs to be a fantastic career which is rewarding and which attracts and retains talented people. But the First Minister will have seen reports of an EIS survey of teachers this week, showing that Scotland is a very long way from achieving that, with the majority of teachers unable to recommend the career to others. Why does the First Minister believe that's the case?
First Minister.
Well, teachers work under significant pressure. I think we all recognise that. I also recognise, just to answer the question directly, that for teachers and for all public sector workers, the last few years of pay restraint have been particularly difficult. For teachers in particular, we know there have been concerns about workload. That's why over the last couple of years, the Deputy First Minister has been working hard to reduce the workload pressures on teachers, including clarifying and simplifying the curriculum framework, reducing, for example, mandatory unit assessments from National 5 Higher and Advanced Higher qualifications. These are all things the EIS and others told us was significantly contributing to unnecessary workloads. So we will continue to work with teaching unions to take such action as we consider appropriate. Of course, we're also working hard to boost teacher recruitment, and as we know from the latest statistics published at the end of last year, teacher numbers increased for the second year in a row, and our attainment programme is having a significant impact on that as well.
Patrick Harvey.
Yet, despite all of this work, nearly 60% of teachers are unable to recommend the profession, and only 2% say that they're very likely to do so. 85% in this survey have said that workload has increased in the last year, despite the government promising to address that. There are complaints about staff shortages, about teachers not having enough time to develop their own learning and their own skills. Yet the government is continuing to focus on preparing an education bill which it knows teachers oppose because it won't address the real problems they face. So will the government now, as the EIS is meeting today in Dundee for its AGM, commit to change its plans for the education bill, work with teachers instead of against them, and commit urgently to meeting the demand for a fair restoration of pay for a profession that is so critical to our young people's future, but which has seen real terms pay eroded far too much for far too many years?
First Minister.
Well, a number of related issues raised in that question. Firstly, in relation to pay, as Patrick Harvey, I assume, is aware, teachers' pay is a matter for the Scottish Negotiating Committee for Teachers. Negotiations for 2018-19 are currently underway. I know the Negotiating Committee has had positive discussions over recent weeks. The Scottish Government takes an active role in these negotiations, and we urge everyone around the table to take a constructive approach. We were the first government in the UK to commit to lifting the 1% public sector pay cap, and I'm proud that we have done that, and that recognises that pay restraint of that order is no longer appropriate for public sector workers. In terms of workload, we will continue to work with the EIS and other teaching unions, and in response to Patrick Harvey's question about the AGM, of course we will continue to listen to teachers and work as collaboratively with teachers as possible. One of the most significant changes we've made in education over the last year or so, of course, is the Pupil Equity Fund, which gives teachers in our classrooms and head teachers control over how that money is spent. And from the teachers I speak to, they are incredibly positive about the transformational impact of that in our education system. So I've made very clear our determination to raise standards and to close the attainment gap. We will work with teachers to do that, but we will continue to take the action we think is necessary in order that we are delivering for young people across the country.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
Delayed discharge far too high. Mental health waits for young people up 60%. Consultant vacancies up 24%. Nursing vacancies up 27%. Nurses quitting the NHS 4,300. NHS staff sickness rates well above the target yet again. Accident and emergency targets missed for 10 months in a row. Will the First Minister just admit her government is failing patients and failing NHS staff?
First Minister.
Let me take the issue of NHS staffing. Staff in post, so not including vacant posts, staff in post working in our NHS are up by 12,900 since this government took office, a 10% increase. We've got more people in each of the last 6 years joining the NHS than have left the NHS. In the last year alone, there are almost 500 more staff in post in the NHS. The nursing vacancy rate has not increased in the last year. The numbers of vacant posts have, but that's because there are more posts overall. The vacancy rate has not increased. The nurse vacancy rate in Scotland is less than half of what the vacancy rate is in England. The consultant vacancy rate has increased under the SNP by 0.5 percentage points, but the consultant establishment in our NHS has increased by 45%. We've also seen medical agency spend in the last year down 8%, nurse agency spend down 4% in the last year. So yes, there are challenges in our health service. We talk about them regularly and rightly in this chamber. We know the reasons for those challenges. They are not unique to Scotland, but we are increasing funding. We're increasing the numbers of people working in our NHS. We're undertaking reform through integration of health and social care. We're putting more money into primary, community, social care and mental health services, and we will continue to do the hard work to deliver for patients the length and breadth of the country.
Willie Rennie.
So if you half close your eyes, things are fine. First Minister, it's time to open your eyes. The British Medical Association, they made it clear. They described it as a lack of substantive progress. The Royal College of Nursing say there aren't enough nurses to provide safe care. The Royal College of Radiologists said their situation is now desperate and warned of collapse. So hasn't the time come for the First Minister to admit the scale of the problem and replace the Health Secretary who cannot control it? For goodness sake, will the First Minister take the summer to replace her health team, or will this Parliament have to do it for her in the autumn?
First Minister.
Well, listening to Willie Rennie there, I can only assume he bitterly regrets that it was his party in coalition with the Tories that kick-started austerity in this country. Qualified nurses and midwives are up by almost 3,000 since the SNP took office. Consultants up by 48% since we took office. A&E consultants have more than tripled. Doctors in training up by 8%. Paramedics up by 19%. We are introducing safe staffing legislation. We're working on that with the Royal College of Nursing. Radiology, we've got a recruitment campaign underway. There's been a positive response to that. Offers of appointment are already being made in boards, in some boards across Scotland. We've got a 100% fill rate at the end of round one of recruitment for training places. We've got 10 extra radiology trainees a year. So I don't deny the challenges in our health service. Every health service across the UK, across Europe and across the world is facing these challenges. But this is a government that's doing the hard work, both in terms of reform and in terms of investment to meet those challenges, and we will continue to get on with that job.
There's still a lot of interest in supplementaries. Could I encourage members to keep their questions a bit shorter than the earlier section? Kezia Dugdale, first of all.
Thank you, President Officer. In Northern Ireland, some women have received longer jail sentences for having an abortion than the men who raped them in the first place. This morning, the Supreme Court ruled that Northern Ireland's almost complete ban on abortion is incompatible with human rights legislation. Can I ask the First Minister if she intends to raise this with Arlene Foster when she visits Scotland later this month? And can I urge her to address the barriers women face boarding ferries in Belfast in accessing services here by introducing a travel bursary for as long as Northern Irish women are denied their basic human rights?
First Minister.
I have no plans to meet with Arlene Foster when she is in Scotland in July, as I understand it. In terms of abortion, I am absolutely in support of ensuring that all women have access to safe abortion services, and that includes women from Northern Ireland. We have, of course, opened up access to abortion services in Scotland for women from Northern Ireland, and we will continue to look at how we make that easier for women to access. So we are doing what I consider to be right. I hope that we will see a government up and running in Northern Ireland again as soon as possible for a whole host of different reasons. I think that would be in the interest of the people of Northern Ireland. And when that government is up and running, I hope one of the things they will address is the current law on abortion, because I think it is deeply unfair and unjust to women right now. And it was so heartening, in my view, to see the Republic of Ireland vote so overwhelmingly to make positive changes to their law. And I hope we will see for not too much longer, Northern Ireland being in the position, not just on abortion, but on equal marriage as well, as the only country in the UK and indeed including the Republic of Ireland out of step on these issues.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. HIV is growing in Scotland. A fresh outbreak which began in Glasgow in 2015 continues, and 13% of Scots infected with the virus don't know they have it. Against that backdrop, HIV Scotland have been in the vanguard of raising public awareness, research and aligning public policy for the best part of a quarter of a century. But we learned this week that most of their government funding, which they've enjoyed for 25 years, will be taken away. Does the First Minister not regard HIV as a problem anymore? And if she does, will she instruct officials to revisit this decision immediately?
First Minister.
Can I say the presentation of this issue in the media this morning, and it's fed through into the presentation of that question, I think is somewhat misleading, and I think it's important to set out the background to this issue. And Alex Cole-Hamilton might actually welcome some of what I'm about to say if he's prepared to listen to it. In 2017, there was an open round held for sexual health and bloodborne virus funding, where organisations, including HIV Scotland, were able to apply for funding. It's important to stress there was no cut in the amount of money available. The amount of money, £1.9 million, was the same as it had been in previous years. A number of organisations applied for that funding. HIV Scotland was one of them, and unfortunately they were not successful. But the decisions were based on advice from an assessment panel which included independent members from NHS Highland, NHS Lothian and the third sector organisation, the Alliance. Now, at that point, the Scottish Government could have done nothing, but that's not what we chose to do, and I made sure that officials were working with HIV Scotland. So, for example, we have already provided HIV Scotland with transition funding to meet their costs in the first 4 months of this financial year. We're providing advice to HIV Scotland to help them put forward and develop a new business plan, which may open up additional Scottish Government funding. We're advising them on how they can attract alternative sources of funding. So the Scottish Government is already working actively with HIV Scotland to try to ensure that it can have a sustainable future, and we will continue to do so. But if we'd interfered in the funding round that I spoke about, that would have involved taking funding away from organisations that had been successful in that open process. And then members, I'm sure, would have been asking me why we had done that. So that's the situation, and we will continue to work positively with HIV Scotland.
Question number 5, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what impact proposed import tariffs on European steel and aluminium by the United States could have on the steel industry in Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, Scottish steel is a quality product which is exported to many overseas markets, including the United States of America. We are extremely disappointed by the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminium. In my view, it is a completely unjustified and unjustifiable decision. A blanket 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminium imports is a seriously retrograde step that will have wider unintended negative impacts across a range of industrial sectors. We've been in contact with the UK Government since this issue first arose in order to try and minimise any impact these ill-conceived tariffs may have on Scotland's steel and aluminium producers.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you. First Minister, the industry body UK Steel has said it's difficult to see what good can come of these tariffs and that UK steel producers will be hit hard. I attended the EU Steel Summit in 2016 and the message was as is now, that global overcapacity can only be solved by multilateral discussions through established international channels. So in the face of Brexit, uncertainty the potential trade war that flies in the face of the Brexiteers' trade optimism, does the First Minister agree with me that the importance of the European Union and access to the single market is an imperative for the steel industry in my constituency of Motherwell Wishaw and the UK?
First Minister.
Well, of course, the member is absolutely right to raise this from her constituency perspective. Scottish steel, as I said, is a quality product, and that includes the specialist heavy plate produced by Liberty Steel in Lanarkshire. So this is an issue that affects parts of the country very seriously. I absolutely agree with Claire Adamson's comments. It's a cliche, many people say it, but it is still true. Nobody wins in trade wars, there are only losers. And I think the decision by the US administration to impose tariffs on exports from the EU and other countries is completely unjustified. It is also at odds with World Trade Organization rules. As we've consistently said and will continue to say, the only way to protect our economy in Scotland and in the UK is through continued single market and customs union membership, and we certainly still hope that that is the position the UK government will eventually adopt once it stops imploding, as it is at the moment. But I do think this, in all seriousness, underlines how utterly ill-advised it is for the UK government to be withdrawing the UK from the single market and customs union and pinning all of its hopes on a trade deal with the current US administration. If they didn't know before that was ill-advised, I think they certainly should now.
Claire Hawkey.
As the First Minister is aware, Clydebridge Steelworks is situated within my constituency of Rutherglen, and I share the deep concerns of my colleague Claire Adamson. Can the First Minister advise whether the Scottish Government have had any particular conversations with Liberty, in particular regarding the effect such tariffs may have on the future of operations and the viability of their Cambuslang site?
First Minister.
Claire Hawkey is right to raise her constituency interest in the form of Clyde Bridge. The Scottish Government has regular discussions with Liberty Steel. We have an excellent relationship with them. They are members of the Steel Sector Round Table, which meets regularly, and the subject of US tariffs was discussed in detail at the last meeting of that group at the end of March. It was chaired by the Minister for Business and attended by Liberty Steel representatives. My officials have had further discussions with Liberty on the issue of tariffs and their impact just this week, and we will continue to speak to them and also to make representations to the UK Government to raise their concerns.
Question 6, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government's 2018-19 budget will be affected by the Scottish Fiscal Commission's downgraded forecast for tax receipts.
First Minister.
It won't be. As I thought Murdo Fraser would have been aware, the revised Scottish Fiscal Commission's forecast will have no impact whatsoever on the Scottish Government's budget for 2018-19. Of course, the income tax policy agreed by this Parliament in February will raise an additional £219 million this year to support public services, tackle poverty and support our economy. The outturn figures for income tax revenues in 2018-19 will be available in July 2020. At that time, the block grant adjustment will also be recalculated and the appropriate reconciliation applied to the 2021-2022 Scottish budget.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank the First Minister for that response? And she is, of course, correct to say there will be no immediate impact on the Scottish Government's budget from these downgraded forecasts. Nevertheless, if the Scottish Fiscal Commission's projections turn out to be accurate, tax revenues will be down £1.7 billion over the next 5 years from the previously predicted figures, and there is an estimated gap in the current financial year of nearly £400 million to be confirmed in 2021. Now, this picture stands in contrast to the UK-wide position on the public finances, where thanks to relatively stronger growth, the Chancellor is currently exceeding his targets for deficit reduction. So how does the First Minister explain this disparity in performance?
First Minister.
Well, actually, in terms of GDP, Murdo Fraser, if he'd read the SFC report, wouldn't need me to explain it to him because the SFC report explains it to him. Basically, the gap in overall GDP growth in Scotland is down to lower population growth. And as the SFC says, when you take that out, Scottish growth is actually much closer to UK growth. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because what affects Scottish population growth is UK immigration policy. And it's because it's so wrong for Scotland that we need to see changes and more control for this Parliament. In terms of the tax forecast, it's important to say, because Murdo Fraser forgot to say, that the SFC forecasts show that revenue from devolved taxes, of course accepting landfill tax, is increasing in each year. And our 2018-19 income tax changes will raise £1.2 billion to help protect public services over the next 5 years. And that's on top of the £800 million in additional receipts, because we chose not to pass on the Tory tax cut to the richest people in our society. So that's £2 billion that, if we followed Tory policy, would be lost to our NHS, to social care, to police and to public services and the economy across Scotland. That's why we will continue to take the action to boost our economy, to get productivity improving and to improve those revenues in future. And just a final word, Presiding Officer. We've had great news about the Scottish economy, so the Tories won't like it. Goods exports in Scotland, according to HMRC figures out just this morning, are outstripping that anywhere else in the UK. So why not have a bit of cheer from the Tories on the Scottish economy?
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. We'll now move to members' business in the name of Richard Lochhead. However, we're going to have a short suspension to allow those who need to leave the gallery to do so, and for our new visitors to arrive. So a short suspension.